London, 1947, August 15th. The Union Jack comes down from the Red Fort in Delhi. India is finally free after 200 years of British rule. We are told it is a story of independence won through nonviolence and moral courage. We are told it is a story of Gandhi's spinning wheel defeating the British sword. That is the story we have been taught. But that story is wrong. India did not win its freedom because Britain suddenly developed a conscience. India was released because Britain had already taken everything there was to take. The empire did not collapse because of protests. It collapsed because the ledger had been balanced. The vault had been emptied. The account was settled. This is not a story about freedom. This is a story about the greatest financial heist in human history. When we think about colonial plunder, we think about the wrong things. We think about the Koh-i-Noor diamond locked behind glass in the Tower of London. We think about the gold statues melted down and shipped to Europe. We think about soldiers looting palaces and stealing jewels. We imagine theft as a physical act, something violent and visible, but that is not how empires really work. The diamonds were just a distraction. The real crime was not committed with swords. It was committed with ledgers. It was not done by generals. It was done by accountants. The greatest theft in history was not a robbery. It was a financial instrument. Recent economic research has put a number on what was taken from India between 1765 and 1938. The number is $45 trillion. Let that number sink in for a moment. $45 trillion drained from a single colony over less than 2 centuries. That is 17 times the entire annual GDP of the United Kingdom today. It is more money than most of us can even conceptualize. It is enough money to fund the Industrial Revolution, fight 2 world wars, and build the entire modern Western world. And it was extracted not through violence alone, but through a financial scam so sophisticated that most people never even understood they were being robbed. To understand how this scam worked, we need to go back to the beginning. We need to see what India was before the British arrived. In the early 18th century, India was not a backward nation. It was the industrial powerhouse of the planet. India produced 25% of global manufacturing output. The textiles woven in Bengal were the finest on earth. The steel forged in South India was stronger than anything Europe could produce. The shipyards of Gujarat built vessels that outperformed the entire Royal Navy. For centuries, Europe had a problem with India. Europe desperately wanted Indian goods. But India did not want European goods. British wool was too heavy for the Indian climate. British manufacturing was crude compared to Indian craftsmanship. So the trade flowed in one direction only. British merchants sailed to India with ships full of silver and gold. They paid Indian merchants in hard currency. Then they sailed home with silk and spices. Europe was bleeding precious metals. India was called the sink of the world's bullion. The Romans complained about it. The Spanish complained about it. The British complained about it. The wealth of the world flowed east, and it stayed there. Then, in 1757, everything changed. The East India Company, a private corporation, defeated the Nawab of Bengal at the Battle of Plassey. Suddenly, a business entity owned the richest province in Asia. In 1765, they were granted the Diwani, the legal right to collect taxes across Bengal. This was the moment the river reversed. This was the moment the drain began. Before 1765, the company had to bring silver from London to purchase Indian textiles. After 1765, they stopped bringing silver entirely. Instead, they used the tax money collected from Bengali peasants to buy the goods they wanted. Think about the mechanics of that system. The Indian farmer paid his tax to the company. The company then used that exact same money to purchase the farmer's cloth. Then the company shipped that cloth to London and sold it for enormous profit. The Indians were paying the British to steal from them. It was a perpetual machine of theft. The victim funded the crime. But this crude taxation system was just the beginning. The British realized they needed something more elegant, more systematic. They needed to control the currency itself. And this brings us to the great monetary crime of the 19th century. This brings us to the war between silver and gold. For most of human history, both silver and gold functioned as money. India operated on a silver standard. The rupee was a silver coin containing a fixed weight of pure metal. Britain used the gold standard. The British pound was backed by gold reserves. For a long time this did not matter because the exchange rate between the two metals was stable. Roughly 15 ounces of silver equaled 1 ounce of gold. This ratio had held for centuries. But in the 1870s, disaster struck the silver market. Massive new silver mines opened in Nevada and across Latin America. The world was suddenly flooded with silver. At the same time, the newly unified German Empire decided to abandon silver and adopt the gold standard. Germany dumped its enormous silver reserves onto the international market. The price of silver collapsed. For a country like India, which held all its wealth in silver, this was a catastrophe. The value of the rupee began to free fall against the British pound. In 1870, 1 rupee was worth about 2 shillings. By 1890, it had crashed to just over 1 shilling. The money in the pockets of ordinary Indians was losing half its purchasing power on the global stage. If India had been an independent nation, it could have protected itself. It could have imposed tariffs on imports. It could have switched to a gold standard. But India was not independent. India was a colony run entirely for the benefit of London. And the bankers in London saw the silver crisis not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. They realized they could use the gap between the cheap silver rupee and the expensive gold pound to engineer a mechanism of permanent extraction. The mechanism was called the home charges. This was an annual bill that the Indian government was forced to pay to Britain. It was presented as payment for the privilege of being ruled. India had to pay for the British soldiers stationed on Indian soil. India had to pay the pensions of British officials who had retired back to England. India had to pay for railway equipment purchased from Britain at inflated prices. And crucially, India had to pay interest on the enormous debt that Britain had piled onto the colony. Here was the trap. Taxes in India were collected in silver rupees from the peasants, but the home charges had to be paid in gold pounds to London. As the price of silver crashed, the Indian government had to collect more and more rupees just to meet the same debt obligation in pounds. It was a treadmill that accelerated every year. If the rupee lost half its value, the peasant had to surrender twice as much grain, twice as much cotton, twice as much labor, just to stand still. The British government could have fixed this problem easily. They could have allowed India to adopt the gold standard. Indian merchants and businessmen begged for it. They wanted a gold rupee that could compete internationally. but London refused. They deliberately kept India locked on a depreciating silver standard while the rest of the world moved to gold. Why did they do this? Because it was fantastically profitable for British business. A cheap rupee meant Indian exports were dirt cheap for British buyers. Britain could purchase wheat, cotton, and jute from India at rock-bottom prices. But it also meant that India could not afford to import machinery or technology from abroad because the rupee was too weak. India was trapped as a supplier of raw materials and a captive market for expensive British finished goods. It was deindustrialization by monetary policy. The greatest manufacturing economy on earth was being strangled by an exchange rate. But the scam went even deeper. It involved the physical removal of gold from India through a system called council bills. This is where the crime becomes almost elegant in its cruelty. Imagine you are a British merchant in London who wants to buy tea from India. You have gold pounds. Normally, you would ship that gold to India to pay the Indian tea grower. If that happened, India's gold reserves would grow and the country would become wealthier. But the British government did not want gold flowing into India, so they intercepted it. They told the merchant, "Do not send gold to India. Instead, hand your gold to the Secretary of State for India here in London. In exchange, we will give you a piece of paper called a council bill. You mail that paper to India. When the tea grower receives it, he takes it to the colonial government in Calcutta. They give him freshly printed rupees created out of thin air from local tax revenue. So what happened to the gold? The gold stayed in London. It was deposited into the Bank of England. It was used to back the British pound. It was loaned to British businesses. It funded the British military. The gold that should have paid for Indian goods never left England. India got paper. London got gold. This system effectively meant that India was exporting its goods for free. The gold that economics dictated should have entered India as payment was hijacked before it even left Britain. Economists call this the absorption of India's balance of trade surplus. India was running a massive trade surplus with the rest of the world. By every law of economics, India should have been accumulating enormous reserves of gold. India should have become the world's banker. But because of the council bill system, every ounce of gold was siphoned away to London. The impact on the Indian peasant was devastating. To pay taxes in a currency that lost value every year, farmers were forced to stop growing food for their families. They had to grow cash crops for export instead. They stopped planting rice and wheat. They started planting cotton, opium, and indigo for the empire. They had to export to survive. They had to sell their grain on the global market to earn the silver needed to pay British taxes. This led to the most horrifying consequence of the entire system. Food left India during famines. In the late 19th century, a series of catastrophic famines swept through India. Millions starved to death. In the Madras famine of 1877, approximately 5 million people perished. And yet, in that same year, India exported a record quantity of wheat to Britain. The telegraph lines and railways, which British propaganda claimed were gifts of civilization, were actually used to suck grain out of the countryside and ship it to London. The railways were not arteries of development. They were extraction tubes. Viceroy Lytton, who governed India during the famine, refused to intervene. He believed in the free market. He believed that if wheat fetched a higher price in London than in Madras, then the wheat should go to London. He argued that interfering with market forces would make peasants lazy. He insisted the silver tax be collected with absolute rigidity. If a peasant could not pay, his land was seized. To save their land, peasants sold everything they owned. They sold their family jewelry. They sold their wives' silver bangles. They sold the small hoards of gold that had been saved for generations. This was the distress gold. During the famines, tons of gold flowed out of Indian villages and into the vaults of the Bank of England. The suffering of the Indian peasant became the liquidity that kept the British Empire solvent. When the London stock market crashed, when the Bank of England needed to shore up its reserves, they tightened the screws on India. They contracted the money supply, forced interest rates up, and squeezed more gold out of the country. The British Empire was a pyramid scheme. India was the base. The stability of the British pound, the currency that ruled the world, depended entirely on the surplus stolen from India. Britain ran a trade deficit with the United States and Europe. They bought more than they sold. By all logic, they should have gone broke. But they balanced their books by taking India's trade surplus. They used India's earnings to pay for their own consumption. As we move into the 20th century, the scale of the theft accelerates. The world is about to be engulfed by 2 global wars, and Britain will find new ways to leverage Indian wealth to fund those wars. When World War I broke out in 1914, Britain needed 2 things desperately. It needed soldiers, and it needed money. India provided both. Over 1 million Indian soldiers served in the trenches of Europe and the deserts of Mesopotamia. But the financial contribution was even more staggering. The British government simply charged the entire cost of deploying those troops to India. They called it India's gift to the war effort. The Indian taxpayer paid for the recruitment, the uniforms, the weapons, and the transport of soldiers who were fighting to defend an empire that oppressed them. This gift amounted to hundreds of millions of pounds. It was a gift extracted from a population that had no vote, no representation, and no say in whether to fight the war at all. But the real financial crime of the 20th century occurred during and after World War II. This chapter is rarely taught in British schools, but it burns in the economic memory of India. It involves something called the sterling balances. When the Second World War began in 1939, Britain was terrified. They knew they could not afford to fight Nazi Germany alone. They turned India into a gigantic supply base for the Allied war effort. Indian factories produced uniforms, ammunition, trucks, and steel. Indian farmers grew food to feed Allied armies from North Africa to Burma. Britain desperately needed these supplies, but they had no money left to pay for them. The British economy was shattered. The gold reserves were gone. So they invented a new system. They simply promised to pay later. Every time the British government bought goods from India, they did not send money. Instead, they credited the payment to an account at the Bank of England in London. These credits were the sterling balances. They were IOUs. India was lending Britain the money to fight the war. The Indian Reserve Bank printed rupees to pay local suppliers, which caused massive inflation inside India. Meanwhile, the British government deposited paper promises in a vault in London. By the end of the war, in 1945, the debt had become colossal. Britain owed India £1.25 billion. In today's currency, that amounts to hundreds of billions of dollars. It was a reversal of history. After 2 centuries of looting, Britain had technically become the debtor. India was the creditor. India had financed its own occupation. India had paid for the British war effort to the point where Britain owed India more than it could ever repay. Logic would suggest that when the war ended and India gained independence, Britain would honor this debt. That capital could have kick-started the Indian economy. It could have built dams, power plants, schools, and hospitals. It was the accumulated savings of a nation that had been starved and overworked throughout the war. During the Bengal famine of 1943, 3 million people died of starvation. Winston Churchill continued to divert food supplies away from India to build reserves for Europe. The food that could have saved those 3 million lives was purchased with these IOUs. The sterling balances were literally blood money. But when the war ended, the British government looked at the debt and decided it simply did not want to pay. Or rather, it could not pay without destroying British living standards. The famous economist John Maynard Keynes, often celebrated as a progressive genius, played a dark role in this story. He advised the British government on how to handle the Indian debt. In private correspondence, he expressed contempt for Indian claims. He suggested the debt should be written down or canceled outright. He argued India should have contributed to the war effort anyway. In the end, Britain did not default openly because that would have destroyed the credibility of sterling on the global stage. Instead, they did something more insidious. They blocked the balances. When India became independent in 1947, the new government asked for its money. Britain said no. You cannot withdraw it all at once. We will release it to you in tiny installments over many years. They froze the assets. Then came the second part of the trick, devaluation. In 1949, Britain devalued the pound against the dollar. Because the rupee was still pegged to the pound, the value of India's savings crashed overnight. By delaying repayment and then devaluing the currency, Britain effectively wiped out a massive percentage of what it owed. They repaid India with money worth a fraction of what it had been when the goods were supplied. It was the final grand larceny of empire. One last trick before the curtain fell.